It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Robert Jan Van Pelt, who is a professor at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture in Toronto. He's been there since 1987. He's held a lot of different positions in higher education in London, Vienna, Virginia, MIT, among others. He has 12 published books on the topic of Auschwitz and the history of the Holocaust. And his work has been featured on the BBC and in movies. So he's, as I said, one of the most distinguished and foremost historians about Auschwitz, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from him today.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to join you in the service today. I was quite touched that Diane mentioned this morning Elie Wiesel and his wonderful observation about the destructive power of indifference. Because actually today I'm finishing reviewing the copy edited manuscript of a book that I have created together with Elie Wiesel's illustrator, Mark Potwell. I mean, Mark Potwell is a New York Times or a New York-based artist, also a physician, who became quite well known in 1972 when he created the image on the op-ed page that commemorated the Munich massacre a day after it had happened in the Olympic Games then. And since then, he's been a regular contributor to the New York Times, is a very well-known artist in the Jewish world, a book illustrator, and became very well-known as the man who created with Elie Wiesel many books they actually conceived together. And so it's a great honor for me to work with him. It's a book on the history of Jewish space, whatever that may be, that we've created to help create a future for a site in Ukraine, in Kiev, known as Babi Yar, or Babin Yar, which is one of a site that is the single largest massacre in the history of the Holocaust. 33,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days in September 1941. And I'm part of a team that is trying to, in some way, shape the future for that site. And one of the things that we're doing right now is actually build a pop-up synagogue that actually will be opened on Yom HaShoah in April this year. And this book accompanies that project. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm actually going to talk about resistance and submission. And I'm going to make, but maybe a little bit of a surprising argument. But before we come to that point, I would like to share my screen. And sorry, I need to go back to the beginning, and I have slides. And so I will wait a moment. Where is my thing? Okay, I should stop this one. So I hope you can all see my slide, and I'm going now into the full screen. Sometimes there are some problems in moving the slides that I can see them moving, but you do not. So if I'm right now moving the slide from the main title, Resistance and Submission, Choices and Choiceless Choices in the German Camps, to the next one, if you do not see assault, oppression, temptation versus resistance right now, please give a shout, then I will use a somewhat different way of showing the slides. In any case, what I'd like to do first is in some way frame resistance, how people have been looking at resistance, especially in the wake of the Second World War. And so quite often the argument, or most traditionally the argument, is that resistance is a response to either an assault, to oppression, or it's a resistance against temptation, the temptation to do evil. And so I grew up in the Netherlands, and already in 1952, a major history appeared of the German occupation of the Netherlands. And the title was Onderdrukking en Verzet, which meant suppression, oppression, and resistance. And so you see in the you see two things on both the poster and then the cover of the book. You see the Nazi flag, symbol of oppression, and you see the flame of resistance, which reminds me in some way of the flame that is also symbolic of your community. And then a version, a more graphic version, is the Dutch lion who emerges from the waters fighting the Nazi eagle. And so very much the idea of resistance is seen as a response. And of course, in that reading of resistance, the dominant form after the both during the Second World War and after the Second World War was armed resistance. That was kind of real resistance. So we see here a picture of a group of resistors taken on the day of liberation, 5th of May 1945. Very proud, it's now safe to come outside, in front of a church in Friesland, and they're holding their stand guns. And of course, this is a picture for posterity. And these men, after the war, mostly men, would march every year on the 5th of May, like the heroes they saw themselves as, and also everyone else saw them as the heroes, the authentic resistors. However, another kind of resistance that had been very important, especially when it relates to the rescue of Jews, which would have been the unarmed resistance. This is people sheltering Jews. So here, for example, we have a picture taken on May 7th, 1945, 2 days after the liberation of the Netherlands, where Koen van Ekeres, a man who owned a small house in Amsterdam, and his wife Elizabeth van Ekeres Junge, you see she has a German maiden name, she came from Germany, are in the basement where during times of danger, the 28 people who were hiding in their little house would find shelter. So this was a little picture made for posterity, but in fact, very important as their resistance was, it was largely forgotten for at least 30 years after the Second World War. It didn't really count as resistance. The armed resistance did. Now, if we go to Auschwitz and you go through the site of Auschwitz-Birkenau, there is a building called the Central Sauna. This was the building in which new arrivals, prisoners who had survived the selection, would be basically registered, shaved. They would be given their prisoners' clothing and so on. And in that space is right now a large exhibition of photos, family photos that were found in Auschwitz after the war. These basically are family photos that people took with them in their luggage. Many of these people, we assume, were people who were murdered in Auschwitz, but these were people who, in a sense, did not resist. These were people who, when they were ordered to go on the trains, actually went on the trains, who arrived in Auschwitz, who didn't rebel, as they came out of the wagons, who submitted themselves to selection, and then who were murdered. And so the question now, which we deal with, is when we're looking at this pre-war life and the fragments of these pre-war life of these people who ended up in Auschwitz, the question, of course, is how to code that. How do we deal actually with this? And I will come back to this idea of going like sheep to the slaughter. And this in some way is where the pivot is of my presentation today. So let us first go back to the basics. Collaboration or resistance. These are the two poles in which mostly the issue of resistance is interpreted. And the argument goes that there is a matter of choice, that we can choose either to collaborate or to be indifferent or to resist. And of course, in this case, the quote by Wiesel is very important. And this goes back to a fundamental assumption that underlies Western civilization and which it does not share with many other civilizations, interestingly. And that is the idea that choice is central, that we have an ability to choose. And very famously, this is expressed in the story of Hercules, where Hercules at a certain moment comes at a fork in the road, and Hercules sees two women, a somewhat voluptuous woman here to the right, who basically beckons him to have a life of pleasure, and to the other side, a woman who basically shows him the difficult path of virtue that goes up. And of course, what Hercules does, he's make the right decision. He goes, in this case, to the left. He goes upward towards a life of virtue and immortality. This is a very basic assumption that underlies our civilization. We can make choices. We always have the opportunity to make choices, and we can make the right choice or the wrong choice. And I would just like to remind you of the fact that this is not necessarily the case in other civilizations. And one of the problems that we probably have in the cultural, somewhat the cultural tension that we have right now with China is because some of these issues which we think are very natural to our moral life are not necessarily the case there. So in the 1970s, a very famous book appeared by a German journalist, Werner Rings, Life with the Enemy, Collaboration and Resistance in Hitler's Europe. And so again, it put resistance as the kind of the other, of the positive towards the negative, that is collaboration. They're always paired. And so I would like now to basically explore a little bit what kind of collaboration and resistance exists. So I'm putting out a kind of a line, a gradient of going from total unconditional collaboration. And this would be, for example, young Dutchmen who in 1942, like the stamps published in German-occupied Netherlands show, joined the SS to fight in Russia. So unconditional collaboration. Then there is a somewhat lesser kind of intense collaboration, which would be exemplified by the Vichy regime, by Marshal Willy Pétain. This is a conditional collaboration. Pétain was not a Nazi. We know that. He was a conservative Catholic Frenchman. He didn't like the Nazis, but he collaborated with the Nazis because he thought it was better for France, because the French had really no choice. So this is a conditional collaboration. It is done, he has still some lines he doesn't want to cross. In the end, it proved to be very few, but it is not that he really believes in what the Nazis represent. Nevertheless, of course, Vichy, Pétain stand for a really bad choice. Then we have something that is called neutral collaboration. This was exemplified, for example, by the Dutch railways. The Dutch railways, the management of the Dutch railways, they basically said, you know, we need to keep the trains running because, first of all, otherwise the personnel of the Dutch railways loses their job. And second of all, with gasoline very scarce, the railways are the only way that we can ensure the food supply and the fuel supply in the Netherlands during the occupation. The fact that also those same trains then would take Jews to the internment camp in Westerbork and afterwards to Auschwitz was just a byproduct of the fact that the system needed to continue to run in order to allow the Dutch population to survive. So this is neutral collaboration. It's not done with any joy, but it is done in simply because they think that this is necessary for the survival of the Dutch nation. The next level would be called tactical collaboration. Tactical collaboration would be the collaboration that's exemplified by King Christian X of Denmark and Chaim Rumkowski. It is you pretend to collaborate, but in fact you try to do something else. You try to resist, you try to get the best out of it. So King Christian X for 3 years, you know, in some way it was nice to the Germans who occupied Denmark. It allowed Denmark actually also to maintain some kind of democratic parliamentary system to function. But in the meantime, he and his government tried to basically obstruct many of the German policies. And the same with Chaim Rumkowski, the elder of the Jews in the Litzmannstadt or Lodz Ghetto. In some way, he pretended to be an ally of the Germans who ran the ghetto, but at the same time tried to create some space for Jewish life and protect as many Jews as he could, which, by the way, turned out not to be that many. And of course, he wanted to protect his own life. Then we come to resistance. So we continue basically from an pole of unconditional collaboration at a certain moment to kind of unconditional resistance. The first form of resistance is what is called a symbolic resistance. And a good example in my country, the Netherlands, was June 29, 1940, which was 6 weeks after the beginning of the occupation, when it was the birthday of Prince Bernard, the husband of the Princess Royal Juliana, the later Queen Juliana. It was his birthday. He always would wear a carnation. That was his, his sense of fashion. And so suddenly, all the flower shops in the Netherlands were sold out of carnations, and everywhere people gathered to put carnations at statues of the kings and stadtholders of the House of Orange. The idea was we are still what we are. We still know who we are. So this is symbolic. A more intense form of resistance would be polemic resistance, where instead of dropping off some carnations, you actually speak the words. This is unacceptable. And this happened at my University of Leiden in November 1940, when Jewish professors were fired by the occupation force, and professors protested. One of them, very famous, Rudolf Klevinga, who held a public lecture, which led immediately to the closure, strike by the students and faculty, and the closure of the university. And the university was not reopened until after the liberation in 1945. So now you put your words basically where your heart is. Part of polemic resistance would also be, for example, the preservation of the story. In the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, the Oneg Shabbat organization, which decided to make a full record of everything that happened to the Jews in the ghetto of Warsaw, burying the records, the diaries, the journals, whatever other material was collected. And here in 1945, boxes and milk cans full of these papers are being recovered. So again, polemic resistance. We will speak the truth, if not alive, then posthumously. Then we come to what we call defensive resistance. This is the resistance to save lives. And one of the most famous people in this story is Irena Zentlerowa, a Polish Christian woman in Warsaw, who is credited with having saved over 2,000 Jewish children, smuggling them out of the ghetto and placing them in foster care with Christians in the city and elsewhere. And it is one of the great privileges in my life that I got to know her when she was very old. She lived in a Catholic old age home, and I was able to visit her a few times. And she, I don't really believe in saints, but if I've ever met a saint, ever seen a saint in my life, certainly that was Irene Zentlerowa. So defensive resistance. Then, and we're following now a traditional typology, one could come to offensive resistance. This would be basically the freedom fighters, the resistors with the arms. In the case of France, it would be the Maquis. And again, this is very much a 1960s kind of male-centered view of how resistance operates. So I'm following this typology that was popular at the time. So now you take up arms, you directly basically enter in a combat with the oppressor. And then finally, something that's called resistance unchained. And these would be the ghetto fighters. That is, they take up arms against the Germans in 1943, in April 1943, knowing very well that none of them will survive, that it's impossible to have any victory except a moral victory for not having given in, for having been seen to stand up for the Jews of the ghetto and for Jews anywhere. Now, so here we have basically the 9 forms of both collaboration and resistance gathered in a single image, with that symbolic resistance of the carnation sitting conveniently in the middle. It's a kind of neutral point. But of course, what one can do is can say, is this actually the right order? Because if we take a 19-year-old young man in the Netherlands who comes from a peasant background, who really doesn't know very much of the world, and when he is in some way convinced by SS Nazi propaganda to join the SS to fight the Bolsheviks in Russia, is he actually more responsible than the 75-year-old Marshall, who has seen everything of the world and who goes into what seems to be a less intense form of collaboration, but surely Pétain should have known better. So one of the things that we can ask now is, and I'm now right now my thing is, isn't it actually that this would be a more proper order? Isn't it that the Director General of the Dutch Railways, who ultimately was responsible for transporting 100,000 Jews to their death, isn't in some way that this man also should know better? So we can start looking actually at the order of things, the order of once we've created a framework to discuss kind of the nature of resistance, and we want to create a hierarchy of it. Certainly for me, Arenda Zentlerova, who was not Jewish and who could have just said, I have nothing to do with this, I'm a good Catholic woman, and this doesn't really touch me. The fact that she actually risked her life to save 2,000 children maybe makes her resistance of a more intense kind than the armed resistance of the young Zionists in the Warsaw Ghetto, who had really no other choice. And so one of the things that you can do is you can play with these various forms of resistance, move the pieces. In this case, I've put the Director General of the Dutch Railways really into the worst form of collaboration. And you see that that in some way I've dropped that 19-year-old SS man really to where I think, okay, this is, I believe in education, and this was an uneducated person who literally, one wouldn't expect him to have made a better choice, given the circumstances where he came from. So the next thing that we need to ask is, we need to, in some way then, once we have defined resistance in relationship to an assault, we have to ask, so what is the nature of the assault? And now I come to Hannah Arendt, the German Jewish philosopher who since 1941 lived in New York, who escaped Europe, and who for me really is a great guide to this question, especially in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she describes basically the universe of the camps, of the German camps, but also of the Russian camps. And she compares that universe to basically the various forms of afterlife as they have been kind of sketched and articulated and theorized in various religions and mythologies. So for example, when we talk about forms of afterlife, we can talk about Hades, the Hades that the Greeks talked about. For example, in the story of the Odyssey, where Odysseus visits the dead heroes in Hades, like Achilles and so on, which is not really a place of punishment. It is simply a kind of gloomy place in which the dead persist. And Hannah Arendt says that if you want to understand one form of internment that existed in German-occupied Europe or German-ruled Europe in the 1940s, and one that she had experienced herself, is the Gurs internment camp, in which Jews were interned in France. Their rights were taken away, but they received food and medical service and so on. But their rights having been taken away, they were not really they were there without any kind of legal procedure having been formed. They were rounded up from the street because they were Jews, but they were not officially imprisoned. And she calls that first level, which she compares to Hades, the assault on the juridical person in man. So the first thing that you do in what you see in the German camps is that basically rights are taken away. But that's not all. She then says there is also something like purgatory, which of course comes from the Christian tradition. And this has to do with morality, she says. And this, of course, is the place where, according to Catholic traditions, the souls are cleansed from their sins for a longer or shorter time. And she said that one of the great issues in the second level in the German camps is that not only your rights were taken away, but that a certain also your ability to act in a moral fashion. This was really in the concentration camps when we symbolized here by the roll call that when we talk about the ability to act morally, there is an assumption that your action will make a difference. Yeah, that the fact of not showing indifference, the fact of showing solidarity will make a difference to not only the person to whom that act is directed, but also to the work in general as an example, like Irina Centlerova is for me. Now, Arendt said that in the concentration camps were designed in such a way that it didn't make a difference anymore what you did as an inmate. That you could be a saint or you could be the worst kind of criminal, but the concentration camp in itself wouldn't know that, wouldn't actually in some way allow for any kind of comment, also for that act to be remembered. It was all in some way a big abyss of forgetfulness. And so she said that in the camps, the moral person in man or humans was also destroyed. The third level of the afterlife, which would be hell, which is the place of permanent punishment in the Christian tradition, this is the image, the metaphor that Arendt basically associates with even a deeper, more destructive layer in the camps, the assault on the individuality of man. She says that is the final um, kernel of what we are, that I am different from somebody else, from everyone else in the world, and that also I can act spontaneously, that I have the ability to do something that's not expected, that I'm not simply a Pavlovian dog. And what she said, so first your rights are taken away, then basically what the Germans said, it doesn't matter if you act honorably or not, because the world will not notice it and it will make no any difference to anyone in this camp. And third of all is that as a result of disease and starvation and despair at a certain moment, people become Musulmaner, the living dead, that they are physically still alive, but in some way that they have lost the sense of being a separate individual. So the typology of Arendt I have worked with, but I added two other layers. One at the beginning, and I call it paradise, and one at the end called Gehenna, which is the Jewish hell. Paradise, the assault on the bearings of man, which is something I see we see very much today. But in some way, I saw a first aspect of that in the Irving trial when I dealt with Holocaust denial, that in some way what fascism does, what communism does, what totalitarianism does, is before it starts attacking our basically our rights, it first starts to in some way confuse us. It starts to assault our bearings. And at the end, of course, of all of this is the actual murder. So there are really 5 steps of assault. Assault on the bearings, our bearings, and of course we've seen that a lot, and we're still seeing that a lot today. Sadly, the assault on our rights, the assault on the sense that we can act morally, the assault on our individuality, and ultimately the assault on our rights. So Gehenna, that is then an even worse kind of hell than the hell of the Christians. Total utter destruction. So that is basically what the crematoria represent. And paradise, again, a situation that is not of this world, and it seems to be kind of nice. We all long for paradise, but it is a paradise of conformity. So the Nazis not only created concentration camps, but they also created labor camps, betterment camps, in which basically the population was made into a unity. Basically, all bodies being exercised to work in the same manner, all minds to think in the same manner. So this is to create an assault on one's bearings. And that, of course, then creates the kind of perpetrator like these SS men from Auschwitz, the commandant, the people who run the crematoria, Dr. Mengele, and so on, who basically run the system of destruction, who are all here involved in a cheerful sing-along after work on a typical day in which over 10,000 people, mostly Jews, would have been murdered. So this is now my universe of the assault. Basically, losing your bearings, paradise on top, on the bottom, Gehenna, pure destruction of the physical life, and in between the three images of losing your rights, losing the ability or the relevance of any moral decision, and losing your individuality. So now the question is, what is your defense? What is the resistance that is possible? So first of all, to assault on your bearings. In some way, it seemed to be the most simplest of decisions, but in fact, it's a very difficult one, just to say no. And I guess it's a loaded term, given the way it was used in the quote-unquote war against drugs. So here, a photo of a gathering of Nazified workers at the German plant. And here we have August Landmesser, who basically doesn't give the salute, refuses to give the salute. And of course, he will come to a bad end during the Second World War. Say no. Then what happens when you lose your rights? In some way, you're going to be dependent on others to take care of you. So here we have a document for basically a list of stuff that can be sent to people in Gurs by an American charity in 1941. And we have an attempt by Heinz Bauer, whose parents were in Gurs, and his sister Suzanne, to basically get her parents out of that camp as late as 1941, besieging American authorities to basically have the consulate in Marseille help these people to leave. They create affidavits of support and so on. In the end, they're not successful. Then, what kind of support can you give in a situation where in some way the moral universe is under assault? Here we have a little clover of 4 that was made in 1944 in an Auschwitz workshop by Esther Friedlander, who was a prisoner, and she was ill, and she had to do slave work, and her fellow inmates, all women, they basically decided to take her workload so that she could find a little bit of rest, and put her in the corner of that factory in Auschwitz and said, you just pretend to work, and we'll basically take care of the work you need to do. And so it was during that pretend work that the tiny little bit of metal she worked into a clover of 4, and she survived. So there was great solidarity. Now, there's really nothing you can do in some way preventing your descent into being a Muslim, being this person who is who basically is a living dead person. Auschwitz survivors, camp survivors always said it was just a matter of luck if you ended up in that condition or not. You know, if at a certain moment you had a blister on your foot, you fell behind because you couldn't walk so far on the way to your slave work, you would be beaten up. It was that blister that ultimately ends up you being beaten up, and before you know it, you cannot work anymore, and you are abandoned for the gas chambers. So that's luck. So that is fortune giving the presents, you know. And then finally, in the case of the struggle against the reality of the murder itself, we have the possibility to rise up, even with a pocket knife. And when we see the little picture below, we see the woman to the left top. She was Rosa Robota, who actually initiated the uprising in 1944 in crematorium number 4, which she supplied. She was in that same factory where Esther Friedlander was, and she was able to smuggle ammunition to the male Sonderkommandos in that crematorium. So a very important resistance fighter. So here we have then crematorium number 4 blown up by the Jewish slave workers. And here we have the site today. So the question, however, is, we accept, of course, that resistance is the right thing to do. But Jewish history actually also shows us there are other options. For example, when the Temple of Jerusalem was burned by the Romans in the year 70 AD, and as a result of that, the Jews were deported from Jerusalem, the beginning of the big exile. Just before that final assault, a rabbi left Jerusalem, went to the besieging Roman army, got an audience with Vespasian, the general in charge, and actually said, I think this is not really working for us. If you give us a village somewhere where I can establish a rabbinical academy, we'll not resist you, we'll surrender, fine. But, he was interested, Yochanan ben Zakkai was interested in the survival of Judaism. And so the Romans agreed to that. And in Yapne or Yavne, which is south of Tel Aviv, he created a rabbinical academy. And it is thanks to that rabbinical academy, and you see Jerusalem, by the way, on this map completely to the right bottom, that Judaism actually still exists today. So maybe surrender is sometimes the right thing to do. Maybe it serves the greater good. So in 1940, a Dutch Jewish thinker, Abel Hertzberg, said, faced with the Nazis, we shouldn't resist. We should follow Yochanan ben Zakkai and in some way create our own Yavne. Yeah? We should in some way just try to survive. Yeah, this force is too big to actually oppose. He survived himself and found himself in 1945 in Bergen-Belsen, but then also acknowledged that probably the Yavne example that might have worked with the Romans might not have been appropriate against the Nazis. But yet, there are still more issues. So here we have the Lamb of God as painted by the French painter Francisco de Zurbarán. Yeah? And of course, this brings us then to a central question in the history of the Holocaust. This is a text from the morning prayer that is said on Mondays and Thursdays by observant Jews. We have become an object of scorn and derision among the nations. We are regarded as the sheep led to the slaughter, to be killed, destroyed, beaten, and humiliated. But despite all this, we have not forgotten your name. This is the name of God, of course. So it's called the Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name, to die as a martyr because you do not want to convert. And of course, throughout the Christian persecution of the Jews until the 20th century, there was always that one way out of the persecution: convert to Christianity and your problems are going to be over. Actually, one set of problems is going to be over, you're going to have a set of new problems. In 1943 already, Emanuel Ringelblum, who created the Onyx Shabbat archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, talked about Jews allowing themselves to be led like lamb to the slaughter. And he said, we must resist this. And he was also the man who initiated the uprising against the Germans in 1943. Therefore, he is seen as a hero. Bruno Bettelheim, a famous psychiatrist who moved in the 1939 to the United States after a short stint in the concentration camp, basically accused the Jews, many Jews, the Jews who had arrived in Auschwitz and the other camps, of in some way having gone to these camps like sheep to the slaughter. And he said, you should have resisted, without, by the way, considering how that could have been done, and without also considering the fact that many others, non-Jews, inclusive millions of Soviet prisoners of war, allowed themselves to be led as sheep to the slaughter. So the question now is, what actually is the choice here? What is the nature of the choice? Here again, we have the image of Hercules, yeah, a different image. And Rabbi Peach Schindler articulated it differently after the war. He said, will we go to our deaths degraded and dejected, or confront death with inner peace, nobility, upright stance, without lament and cringing to our enemy? So this is to actually put the choice very differently, to recognize that actually an uprising is not going to be realistic, but to die with dignity. And this becomes central to the work of Imre Kertész, a writer that very much has shaped my view of resistance, who got the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2002, a survivor of Auschwitz. He was 14 years old, old 14 years old, but he was a big boy when transported to Auschwitz in 1944. And because he was big and because he said he was 16, survived selection and ultimately survived that camp and 2 other camps. So at selection, of course, young people would typically not survive. But after the war, he, in the 1960s, he got to see this picture and other pictures of the selection taken by Germans in 1944. And he looked at the way people were behaving. And he said, in some way, he remembered it also himself. Everyone tried to, in some way, appease the Germans. What you do when you're stopped on the highway and there's your state trooper and asks you to, basically has stopped you, comes to the side of your car. You do not basically give him the finger. You put the window down and you say, what's the matter, officer? And you give a big smile. And he said that's exactly what happened when people arrived in Auschwitz. You try in some way to accommodate with the powers that are. And so if you see those young men, and especially the one who's talking right now to the German officer in the selection, you see there's a kind of willingness to engage. And for Kertész, this became very important. What I think is the most important novel written on the Holocaust, Faithlessness, Zorstan Lanzak, published first in the mid-1970s. And this is the book that got him the Nobel Prize, and I very much recommend it to your attention if you already don't know it. It was made into a famous movie in 2005. Here we have the young, basically alter ego, George Koves, before his deportation to Auschwitz. He's now already wearing the star. And in the camp, basically, this is actually in subcamp of Buchenwald. And then after his return, his survival and return to Budapest, where he needs to explain to people who don't really know how to imagine the camps, what it means to be there. And when at a certain moment he challenges himself and he asks himself, why did I go along with all of this? Why did I actually make every step? And he said, I cannot blame the Germans for the fact that I made those steps. I basically moved step by step by step on the in the rampe in Auschwitz towards that officer who selected me. I obeyed. And he says ultimately, it was actually a kind of matter of honor to actually accept my fate. And this is why the title also deals with the idea of fate. So right now, an exhibition is up in New York that I helped organize. I was the chief curator of it. We did it with a Spanish company, Musealia Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away. This is the original, some photos from the original showing in Madrid. It's a very large exhibition, some 25,000 square feet. It has 750 original artifacts. Here we're right at the beginning with a shoe found in Auschwitz. We have original posts from Auschwitz here displayed against a large photo with original barbed wire. The desk of the commandant, it is an incredible collaboration with the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum to bring very important artifacts, first to Madrid, then to New York, and we're going to Kansas City if COVID allows it this summer. This is the point where we show selection, which is represented by a pair of boots of an SS officer, a gas column, a reconstruction of the apparatus that was used in the gas chambers to introduce the Zyklon, the cyanide, the exhibition of the belongings, the meager belongings of the deportees, who of course had been robbed of everything before. We have an original barrack from Auschwitz. And in some way, we have all different forms of resistance embodied in a special room of the exhibition: Resistance and Change, Defensive Resistance. For example, that little clover made in the Auschwitz factory comes from our existence. Polemic resistance, or I tell the truth. We have documents that were smuggled out of Auschwitz to tell the truth to the world. Symbolic resistance, or I remain what I was. And in some way, as we were looking at this exhibition, we have, and this is in New York now, we have here two items from Auschwitz, and this is where I end my story. One of them is a talit, katan, which is a little prayer shawl that Orthodox men wear, typically under their shirt, and that basically is to remind them of the fact of the commandments, to remember the commandments. And uh, a prisoner in Auschwitz risked his life every day to wear this under his prisoner uniform. And then we have a shofar. This is a ram's horn that is used on New Year and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to basically summon the Jewish people and to shatter open the separation between the earth and the heavens, so that God's mercy may come down. It is an instrument, of course, that is mentioned in the Bible many times. It was blown at Mount Sinai when the Jews received the Torah, and also, of course, during battles. And this shofar was blown in Auschwitz. And of course, normally we talk about this idea of preserving your identity. That might be quite a secretive act, but to blow a shofar in Auschwitz in New Year's 1944 is a very, very public act that basically invites immediate retaliation. The man who received the man who blew the shofar, as far as we know, didn't survive. But I mean, we know he didn't survive because he died on the death march from Auschwitz. But this man, Haskell Tidor, received from that man the shofar during the death march in January 1945 on the way to Buchenwald, and also the story. And it is from his daughter that we got, basically, who lives in Israel, that we got the shofar with the story. And so what I would like to end with is this moment of resistance that was witnessed in Auschwitz by people on New Year's 1944 in the blowing of the shofar, to maintain the tradition, to persist in an affirmation of identity. And so when just before COVID in 2019, in early September, the shofar arrived from Israel. We installed it in our exhibition in New York. But before we did it, we actually had it blown first outside and then also on New Year's. So I have this little footage of the blowing of that shofar by the rabbi of the Reform Synagogue on Fifth Avenue in the Garden of Stones that faces the Statue of Liberty at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And I would like then, not with my own voice to end, but with the voice of the shofar. And thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts with you.